Now, let's look at what happens when we change the first lower class limit. Here are the three possible GFDTs we could obtain with a class width of 6 for this psychology final exam dataset. In our first GFDT on the left, we see that the first lower class limit is 38 and the last upper class limit is 120. It turns out that 120 is indeed the maximum for this dataset. However, as you might recall, and as we will see shortly, 38 is not actually the minimum of the dataset. The one thing we can say here is that the minimum score for our data is somewhere in the first class, and the maximum score is somewhere in the last class. Else we would either need more classes to capture the entire dataset, or we would have extraneous classes at the top or bottom of the GFDT with zero frequencies. It is not unreasonable to assume that all the data has been displayed or summarized if there is not a clearly indicated note stating otherwise. In the next GFDT, in the middle, we have changed the first lower class limit from 38 to 40. Since we didn't need a new row for any values at 38, this means that there were actually no data values of 38 for this exam. We also note that the last class's upper class limit is now 122, which is actually larger than the maximum value possible for this test. 60 questions at 2 points each gives a maximum score of 120. In the last GFDT on the right, we changed the lower class limit from 40 to 42, but this now leaves the minimum value of 40 without a class. So we need to add the class right below, which means our first lower class limit, LCL, is actually 36. This means that the only value in the class 36 to 40 is the single score of 40, the actual minimum of the data set. But we wouldn't normally know this without having either the original data or having all three versions of this GFDT with the same class width, which is often the case when we are working with a final presentation summarizing the data. We also note that the last class is 120 to 124, but this means that all the tallies here represent those students that scored a perfect score on this test, as the scores of 122 and 124 are not possible. If we know the context of the dataset, this information could be easily extracted from just the GFDT, such as this third variation. Otherwise, we would not know what the values of the data in the last class actually would be. Finally, we note that each of the tally plots shown here for these three GFDTs are all generally similar in nature, but they are all slightly different from each other. Again, this is because the starting lower class limit for the first class was changed. That is, the point from where we started walking was different for each GFDT tally plot. Correspondingly, each tally plot is just a little different from each of the other tally plots.